The dust had been a constant companion for 3 weeks, a fine red powder that settled in the creases of Cora's dress, in the lines of her palms, and at the back of her throat. It was the taste of her new life, the stagecoach, a bone-jarring cage of weathered wood and cracked leather, groaned with every rut in the trail, a sound that had long since replaced the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Outside, the land was a merciless expanse of sun-bleached grass and distant, hazy mountains that offered no comfort, only a sense of her own smallness. She clutched the handle of her single satchel, the worn leather cool against her damp skin. Inside was everything she owned: 2 spare dresses, a photograph of a mother she barely remembered, and a packet of letters from a man whose face she had only ever imagined. Mr. Arthur Swanson. His words were plain, honest. A widower with a modest plot of land and a need for a wife. He wrote of building a life, of shared work and quiet companionship. He had not written of love, and for that, Cora was grateful. Love was a language she no longer trusted. She sought solid ground, a place to stand where the earth did not constantly shift beneath her feet. This dusty town, redemption, was to be that ground. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a halt, the sudden silence was more jarring than the noise. Cora blinked against the harsh afternoon light, her legs stiff as she descended the steps. Redemption was little more than a single, wide street flanked by raw timber buildings with false fronts that did little to hide their humble construction. A saloon, a blacksmith, a general store, and a church with a stark white steeple that seemed to protest the endless, dusty brown of its surroundings. The few people on the boardwalk stopped to stare. Their faces were hard, weathered by sun and suspicion. A woman in a severe black dress pulled her child closer, her lips a thin, disapproving line. Cora felt their collective gaze like a physical weight, the immediate and unquestioning judgment of a closed community. She was an outsider, an unknown quantity, and therefore a threat. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smells of horse manure, wood smoke, and baking dirt, and walked toward the largest building, Henderson's General Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, hollow welcome. The store was a dim, crowded space filled with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and bolts of calico. A man with a graying beard and a stained apron looked up from behind the counter. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone flat. "I am looking for Mr. Arthur Swanson," Cora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He is expecting me. My name is Cora Hobbs." The storekeeper's expression flickered from indifference to a sort of clumsy pity. He wiped his hands on his apron. A slow, deliberate gesture. "Ah, you're Miss Hobbs." He glanced toward the back of the store, as if hoping for someone to come and take this burden from him. No one did. He cleared his throat. "Well, miss, I'm afraid I have some terrible news. There was an accident, out at his place 2 days ago." Cora stood perfectly still. The world seemed to narrow to the space between her and the storekeeper, the motes of dust dancing in the shafts of light from the grimy windows. "A new bull he'd bought," the man continued, his voice low. "It was a powerful, mean animal. Got him in the barn. By the time his neighbor found him, well, there was nothing to be done. We buried him yesterday." The floorboards beneath Cora's feet felt unsteady. Buried. The word was so final, a shovelful of dirt thrown on the faint, flickering ember of hope she had so carefully nursed. She had not known this man, had not loved him, but he had been her destination. He was the anchor she had been sailing toward across a desolate sea, and now he was gone. She was adrift. "I see," she whispered. The sound was thin, fragile. She felt the eyes of the other customers in the store, 2 women who had been examining a length of ribbon and were now watching her with a morbid curiosity. Their whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves. "What will you do now, Mr.?" Henderson asked, not unkindly, but with the practical air of a man who saw a problem that needed solving. Cora had no answer. Her family was gone. A father lost to consumption and a mother to grief long before that. The home she had fled held nothing for her but the ghost of a promised life that had turned into a cage. She had used her last dollar for the stagecoach ticket. She had nothing. She was nothing. I do not know, she admitted, the words tasting of ash. She turned and walked out of the store, the bell mocking her with its chime. The sun was still bright, the town still hostile. She stood on the boardwalk, a solitary figure with a single satchel, the whispers following her from the store and seeming to echo from the windows of the houses down the street. She was stranded. She was still standing there, lost in a silent panic, when a man on a dusty bay horse rode up the street and dismounted in front of the store. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a grim economy of motion that suggested he wasted nothing, not even a step. He wore a plainsman's worn trousers and a dark, collarless shirt, faded by sun and work. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see a square jaw covered in dark stubble and a mouth set in a permanent, unyielding line. He did not look at her as he tied his horse to the hitching post, but she felt his awareness of her, a brief, dismissive assessment. He went into the store. A few minutes later, he came out with a sack of flour slung over one shoulder and a smaller parcel in his hand. He stopped when he saw she was still there, a statue of quiet desperation. For the first time, his eyes met hers. They were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, weary sorrow that seemed at odds with the hardness of his face. He looked away, toward the far-off hills, his jaw tight. Mr. Henderson had followed him out onto the boardwalk. "It's a sad business, Eli," the storekeeper said, nodding toward Cora. "This is the woman who was meant for Arthur Swanson." The man, Eli, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He said nothing. His silence was vast and unnerving, a wall she could not hope to scale. "She has nowhere to go," Mr. Henderson added, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. "The preacher's wife won't take her in, says it wouldn't be proper, and there isn't a boarding house in town that's fit for a lady." Eli's gaze swept over her again, lingering for a fraction of a second. He seemed to be weighing her, measuring her, as if she were a head of cattle. Cora straightened her spine, a flare of pride cutting through her fear. She would not be discussed as if she were a stray dog. "I can work," she said, her voice finding a surprising strength. "I am not looking for charity." Eli ignored her, his attention fixed on the storekeeper. Then, with a sigh that seemed to rise from a place of profound exhaustion, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel. "She can come with me." It was not an offer, but a declaration. "Mr." Henderson looked relieved. Cora was too stunned to speak. This man, this stranger with haunted eyes and a wall of silence around him, was her only option. He gestured with his head toward his horse. "Get your bag." Without another word, he swung the sack of flour onto the back of his horse, secured it, and then mounted in a single, fluid motion. He looked down at her, waiting. There was no kindness in his expression, only a grim resolve, taking a breath that felt like she was breathing in ground glass. Cora picked up her satchel and walked to him. He did not offer a hand. She placed her foot in the stirrup and awkwardly pulled herself up to sit behind him, her skirts bunching around her legs. Her hands hovered, unsure where to rest, before she placed them lightly on the back of the saddle, careful not to touch him. "Hold on," he grunted. He spurred the horse, and they moved down the street, away from the staring eyes and the whispering curtains. Cora did not look back. There was nothing there to look back on. The ride was long and silent. The man, Eli, offered no conversation, and Cora asked no questions. His back was a rigid wall of muscle against which she tried not to lean. The landscape grew wilder, the trail narrowing as they moved into the rolling, scrub-dotted hills. They passed no other homesteads. The isolation was profound, a silence broken only by the plodding of the horse's hooves and the cry of a distant hawk. This man was a loner, she realized. He lived apart from the world, and he was taking her into his solitude. His ranch was nestled in a small, windswept valley, a collection of weathered gray buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty land. The main house was a simple, unpainted clapboard structure with a sagging porch. A large barn stood nearby, its roof patched in several places, along with a corral and a few smaller outbuildings. The place had an air of neglect, not of decay, but of a life lived without any attention to comfort or grace. It was a place of function, of survival, and nothing more. He dismounted and came around to her side. "Get down," he said. He did not help her, but simply stood there, waiting. She slid awkwardly from the horse, her muscles aching. "The house is there," he said, pointing. "There's a spare room. It was my brother's. You can stay there." He pulled the flour sack from the horse. "I have work to do." He turned and strode toward the barn, leading the horse, leaving her alone in the yard with her satchel. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. She looked at the house. It was a shelter, nothing more, a temporary reprieve from the judgment of the town. She took a deep breath and walked up the rickety porch steps. The door opened into a large main room that served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. A thick layer of dust covered everything, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace black with soot, shelves holding a few tin plates and mugs. The air was stale, smelling of old smoke and disuse. It was clear no woman had set foot in this house for a very long time. A closed door presumably led to his room, another to the one he had offered her. She opened it and found a small, Spartan space containing a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a small washstand, and a single window looking out onto the unforgiving hills. It was more a cell than a room, but it was a place to close a door, to be alone. In the days that followed, a strange, silent routine established itself. Eli rose before dawn and was gone, working his small herd of cattle that grazed in the high pastures. He would return long after dusk, his face grim with exhaustion, eat the meal she left for him on the stove, and then retire to his room without a word. Cora rarely saw him, yet his presence filled the small house. It was in the scent of leather and sweat on the air when he returned, the heavy, measured tread of his boots on the floorboards, the deep, ragged cough she sometimes heard through the thin wall that separated them. He was a man wrapped in a shroud of his own making. Cora saw the signs of a past he fought to keep buried. When he thought she was not looking, she saw him rub his left shoulder, a habitual gesture of old pain. Once, when he was mending a harness on the porch, his sleeve rode up, and she saw a puckered, angry scar on his forearm, the kind left by a blade. He caught her looking, and his eyes went cold. He pulled the sleeve down, and the wall between them grew a little higher. He never spoke of the war, but she knew. She had seen men like him before, men who had looked into the abyss and brought a piece of it back with them. The town had not forgotten her. One afternoon, a buggy pulled into the yard. It was the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was as sharp and unyielding as her features. She did not get down from the buggy, but summoned Cora with a flick of her wrist. "Miss Hobbs," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I have come to express my concern. The ladies of the church feel your living situation is unseemly. It is an affront to common decency for an unmarried woman to reside under the same roof as a man like Eli Morgan. Mr. Morgan has offered me shelter when no one else would." Cora replied, her voice level. "I have my own room. I am earning my keep." "Earning your keep?" Mrs. Gable's thin lips curled into a semblance of a smile. "We all know what kind of work a woman like you might be doing for a man like him." The insult was a physical blow. Cora felt the blood rush to her cheeks, but she held the woman's gaze. "I will not be a burden to him or anyone else. I intend to find proper work in town as soon as I am able." "I highly doubt anyone will be willing to hire you, given the circumstances." "Mrs. Gable sniffed. "You would do well to remember your place. This town does not look kindly on immorality." With a sharp snap of the reins, she turned the buggy around and left in a cloud of righteous dust. The encounter left a bitter taste in Cora's mouth, but it hardened her resolve. She would not be defined by their cruel whispers. She poured her energy into the house. She scrubbed the floors until the pale wood shone. She washed the grimy windows, letting in the fierce, bright sunlight. She aired out the musty bedding, patched the worn curtains, and swept the soot from the fireplace. She found a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house and began to tend it, her hands finding a strange solace in the feel of the cool, dark earth. She cooked, making simple, hearty meals of beans and cornbread, leaving a plate warming on the stove for Eli each night. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to change. It began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The air no longer smelled of disuse, but of baking bread and scrubbed pine. It was a small, fragile warmth in the face of a vast and indifferent landscape. Cora, too, was a keeper of scars. She had her own ghosts, her own past that she kept locked away. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, a memory would surface unbidden. The heavy, sweet smell of whiskey on a man's breath. A voice, once gentle, turned sharp and menacing. The sudden, terrifying strength in a hand that gripped her arm too tightly. She would touch the faint, silvery line on her collarbone, hidden by the high neck of her dress, a relic of a night she had nearly not survived. She had come west not just for a husband, but to outrun a memory, to find a place where the name whispered by her abuser could not reach her. She saw in Eli's silence a mirror of her own, a shared understanding that some wounds never truly healed. One evening, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a low rumble echoed through the hills. A storm was coming. Eli came in from the barn, his face tight with worry. "The sorrel mare," he said, the most he had spoken to her in a week. "She's about to foal. I need to get her inside." Cora nodded and followed him out into the rising wind. The air was electric, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. They worked together to lead the nervous, heavily pregnant mare into the relative shelter of the barn. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as they slid the heavy barn door shut, plunging them into a warm, hay-scented dimness. Eli lit a lantern, and the golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing the mare's distress. Her sides were heaving, her eyes wide with pain and fear. "It's coming soon," Eli said, his voice low and calm as he ran a soothing hand down the mare's flank. The storm broke then, a furious assault of wind and rain that battered the old barn. The roof groaned, and rain found its way through the patched shingles, dripping onto the hay-strewn floor. For hours, they worked by the flickering lantern light, a small, self-contained world against the chaos outside. Cora brought water and cloths, murmuring soft words to the laboring animal, her earlier fear replaced by a focused determination. Eli was surprisingly gentle, his large, calloused hands deft and sure as he guided the mare through the birth. Finally, with a last, shuddering groan, the foal was born, a wet, spindly creature that struggled to its feet on impossibly long legs. A fragile new life in the midst of the storm. The mare began to lick her newborn clean, her maternal instincts taking over. A sense of quiet awe filled the barn. The fury of the storm seemed to recede, its roar a distant backdrop to the gentle sounds of the mare and her foal. Cora and Eli stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, watching the miracle they had helped bring into the world. They were both exhausted, damp with sweat and rain, and smeared with the grime of their work. "She's beautiful," Cora whispered, her voice filled with a wonder she had not felt in years. "She is," Eli agreed, his own voice softer, the usual gravelly edge worn smooth by the night's efforts. He turned to look at her, and in the warm, dancing light of the lantern, the walls he kept around himself seemed to dissolve. She saw not just the haunted loner, but the man beneath, a man capable of a profound and weary tenderness. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and the air between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. The space that separated them seemed to shrink until it was nothing at all, just the charged air, the scent of hay and rain, and the sound of their own breathing. He lifted a hand, as if to touch her cheek, his fingers hovering just inches from her skin. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. She did not move, did not breathe. For a fleeting, infinite moment, she thought he would lean in, that he would close the distance, that his lips would meet hers. A desperate, foolish longing rose in her, a desire to be seen, to be touched, to feel something other than fear and loss. But the moment passed. His hand dropped to his side, his jaw tightened, and the mask of the stoic cattleman slid back into place. He turned away from her, his attention abruptly fixed on a loose buckle on a harness hanging from the wall. The silence that fell between them was heavier than any words could ever be. Something had sparked in the candlelight, a fragile, wordless connection that they were both too broken, too afraid to acknowledge. They finished their work in silence, making the mare and foal comfortable for the night. When they finally left the warmth of the barn and walked back to the house through the now dwindling rain, the distance between them felt wider than ever before. Neither of them spoke of it. They would never speak of it, but in the quiet darkness of their separate rooms, listening to the rain drip from the eaves, neither of them could forget the feeling of standing so close, of almost, letting the world fall away. The night in the barn had drawn a new, invisible line between them. The air in the small house was now thick with the memory of what had almost been, the ghost of a touch, the echo of a shared breath. Eli was more silent than ever, his movements around the ranch deliberate and contained, as if he feared any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile truce they had built. Cora, in turn, was careful, her words measured, her presence a quiet offering of peace he seemed determined to refuse. She would leave his dinner on the table, not the stove, a small change that meant she would be in her room when he came in, avoiding the potential for their paths to cross in the narrow confines of the main room. They were two solitary planets orbiting a single, dying star, close enough to feel the pull but never touching. The outside world, however, had no respect for their unspoken boundaries. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, returned a week later. She did not wait in her buggy this time, but marched up onto the porch, her Bible clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Miss Hobbs," she began without preamble, her eyes sweeping over the clean porch and the pot of wild geraniums Cora had placed by the door, her expression souring as if the small signs of care were a personal offense. "I have prayed on your situation. The Lord is a forgiving God, but he does not smile upon sin." Cora stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her. "There is no sin here, Mrs. Gable." "Is there not?" The woman's voice was sharp. "A woman's reputation is a fragile thing, easily shattered. To live under the protection of a man like Eli Morgan, a man who shuns God's house, a man with a past steeped in violence, it invites a certain kind of speculation. He has certain appetites. A man like that." She let the insinuation hang in the air, ugly and venomous. "I am here to warn you, for the good of your soul, leave this place. The town will not abide it." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war. "Mr. Morgan has shown me more decency than anyone in your town," Cora said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am not the one who is lacking in Christian charity, Mrs. Gable." For a moment, the preacher's wife looked genuinely shocked, As if she had been slapped, she sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red. "You will regret your impudence," she finally managed, before turning on her heel and marching back to her buggy, a soldier retreating from a battle she had unexpectedly lost. Cora's victory was hollow. The woman's words were a poison that had already seeped into the town's bloodstream. She discovered the full extent of it 2 days later, determined to be a burden on no one. She walked the long miles into Redemption, her best dress neatly pressed, and went to Henderson's General Mercantile. "Mr. Henderson looked up, his face a mask of weary apology before she had even spoken. "Miss Hobbs." "Mr. Henderson, I know it is a great deal to ask, but I am a hard worker. I can keep stock, I can sew, I can manage accounts. I would be grateful for any work you could offer," she said, her speech rehearsed and clear. He wrung his hands, his gaze darting to the 2 other customers in the store, a pair of women who were now pointedly ignoring them, their backs ramrod straight. "Cora, Miss Hobbs, I cannot—" "Why?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "My customers," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. They would not be comfortable. A woman in your situation. It is bad for business." A woman who had been pricing fabric suddenly turned, her purse held tight against her chest, and walked out without a purchase. The bell on the door a final, damning judgment. Humiliation burned in Cora's throat, hot and bitter. She had been tried and convicted without a trial, her sentence to be a pariah. She gave a stiff nod, turned, and walked out into the unforgiving sunlight, her hopes for independence crumbling to dust around her feet. She was halfway back to the ranch, her spirit as weary as her legs, when a young rider approached. He was no more than 17, with a scattering of freckles across his nose and a guileless, open face. He pulled his horse to a stop beside her. "Ma'am, you are Miss Hobbs, are you not?" he asked, his voice polite. "I am." "My name is Jesse. I work for Mr. Morgan sometimes, when he needs an extra hand with the cattle. He is a good man, ma'am, pays fair." He seemed to feel a need to defend Eli, a loyalty that surprised her. "It is a long walk. You should not be out here alone." His simple, unadorned kindness was so unexpected it almost brought tears to her eyes. "I am fine, Jesse, thank you." "The folks in town," he said, looking down at his saddle horn. "They do not know anything. They just like to talk." He looked up, his blue eyes earnest. "You have made that old house a home. I saw it when I dropped off some feed last week. It has never looked so fine." They spoke for a few more minutes, a brief, sunlit conversation about horses and the coming change in the weather. And then he tipped his hat and rode on. The encounter was a small balm on a fresh wound, a reminder that not all hearts in this land were hard and closed. That comfort was brutally stolen from her 3 days later. It was nearly dark when Eli rode in, not alone, but with a limp body draped over the front of his saddle. Cora's heart seized in her chest before she recognized the slight frame and sandy hair. It was Jesse. Eli carried him into the house and laid him gently on the cot in Cora's room. The boy was a mess of bruises and cuts, his left eye swollen shut, his lips split and bleeding. He was conscious, but barely, moaning softly. "What happened?" Cora whispered, rushing to get a basin of water and clean cloths. "4 men, outside the saloon." Eli's voice was a low, dangerous growl, tighter than she had ever heard it. "They were drunk. Heard them talking about the harlot at my place. Jesse told them to shut their mouths. Said you were a lady." Cora's hands trembled as she dipped a cloth into the water. This was her fault. The boy's battered face was a testament to the town's hatred for her. Eli worked beside her, his movements economical and surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wounds with an antiseptic that made Jesse hiss with pain, his touch firm but steady. There was a grim competence about him, the practiced air of a man who had tended many wounds and seen far worse. After they had cleaned him up and bandaged a nasty cut on his forehead, Jesse drifted into an exhausted sleep. Cora stood looking down at him, a wave of guilt and fury washing over her. "They did this because of me," she said, her voice thick with self-loathing. Eli was standing by the window, staring out into the blackness. "They did this because they are small, cruel men," he said, his back to her. "This has nothing to do with you." But it did, and they both knew it. She was the stone dropped into the stagnant pond of their town, and the ripples were turning ugly. The next day, while Eli was out mending a fence and Jesse was sleeping, Cora found herself unable to rest. The house felt suffocating. She began to clean, a frantic, desperate need for order driving her. She dusted shelves that were already clean, scrubbed floors that already shone. She went into Eli's room. It was something she had never done, a violation of the unspoken boundary between them. But she felt compelled, as if the answer to the violence and hatred lay somewhere within his guarded world. His room was even more Spartan than hers. A bed, a chest of drawers, a single chair. No pictures, no decorations, nothing to speak of the man who lived there. It was the room of a ghost, tucked away on the bottom of the chest, beneath a stack of folded shirts. She found it, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover softened with age. Her fingers hesitated. This was his, a place she had no right to be. But the image of Jesse's bruised face flashed in her mind, and she opened it. The handwriting was not Eli's rough scrawl, but a more refined, elegant script. She turned to the first page. Thomas Morgan, his journal, his brother. Her heart gave a painful thud. She knew she should close it, put it back, but she could not. She read only a few pages, her eyes scanning the entries. They were the simple observations of a young man full of life, descriptions of the land, sketches of horses, thoughts on the future, and they were full of his older brother. "Eli is the strongest man I know." One entry read, "He can outride and outshoot anyone in the territory. He watches over me, always has. He pretends his heart is made of stone, but I know better." She flipped forward, the pages more worn now. The date was from years ago, during the war. "The fighting has changed him. We won the skirmish today, but there was no victory in his eyes, only emptiness. It is a look I have seen in other men, the ones who have seen too much. I fear a part of him died out here on this cursed plain, and I do not know if he will ever get it back. I pray for him. He still has so much love inside him. I pray he does not waste it." A floorboard creaked in the main room. Cora's head snapped up, her heart pounding. Eli stood in the doorway, his frame filling it entirely. He had come back for a tool. His eyes, those pale gray winter skies, went from her to the open journal in her hands. The air crackled. The color drained from his face, replaced by a dark, rising tide of fury. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice lethally soft. I was cleaning," she stammered, closing the journal, the lie weak and foolish. He strode into the room in 2 long steps and snatched the book from her hands, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was like a brand. "Get out," he snarled. "Eli, I am sorry. I should not have—" "You have no right," he interrupted, his voice rising to a raw shout that echoed in the small room. He held the journal as if it were a living thing, a piece of his own heart that she had desecrated. "You know nothing about him. You know nothing about me." His rage, so long contained, was a terrible thing to behold. But it did not frighten her. Instead, it struck a familiar, discordant chord deep within her, a memory of another man's fury, and it ignited her own. "And you know nothing about me," she retorted, her own voice rising to match his. "You stand there in your fortress of silence, judging me, judging the whole world. Do you think you are the only one who has ever lost someone? Do you think you are the only one with scars?" She gestured wildly around the room. "Around the house. I have tried to make a life here. I have tried to be worthy of the shelter you gave me, but it is not enough, is it? Nothing is enough. This has nothing to do with worth, he ground out, his jaw so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. This is about privacy, about respect for the dead. The dead? Her voice broke with a bitter, hysterical laugh. I know about the dead, and I know about the ones who make you wish you were dead. The words were out before she could stop them, torn from a place she kept locked and bolted. His anger faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. I was to be married once before, she said, the confession pouring out of her now, a torrent of pain. To a man my father chose, a good man, everyone said respected. He did not drink, but he had a temper that came on him like a fever. One night, he decided I had looked at another man for too long at a town social. He waited until we were alone. She instinctively touched her collarbone, the place where the thin, silvery scar lay hidden. He told me he was teaching me a lesson, that a wife must be obedient. He almost killed me. I left before he could finish the job, before he could put his ring on my finger and own me completely. The fury had gone out of the room, sucked away by the raw horror of her story. All that was left was the trembling silence, the sound of their ragged breaths. Eli stared at her, his pale eyes wide, the journal held forgotten in his hand. The rage in his face had been replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. Not for himself, but for her. She had laid her own shattered past at his feet, and in doing so, had somehow walked through the wall of his. He looked at her, truly saw her. For the first time, he saw not the mail-order bride, not the town scandal, but a fellow survivor. Without thinking, she stepped forward, closing the small space between them. She raised a trembling hand and laid her palm against the rough stubble of his cheek. His skin was hot. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his powerful frame. For a heartbeat, he leaned into her touch, a silent surrender. The air was thick with the scent of him, leather, sweat, and something more, something elemental and male. She could feel the violent pounding of his heart, or perhaps it was her own. He should have kissed her then. She wanted him to, with a desperation that terrified her. She wanted him to crush his mouth to hers, to block out the memories, to feel the solid, living presence of him. But he did not. His eyes opened, filled with a torment she could not decipher. He took a step back, breaking the connection. The loss of it was a physical blow. Without a word, he turned and left the room, the journal still clutched in his hand. That night, sleep would not come. Cora lay on her narrow cot, staring into the darkness, her body humming with a strange, painful energy. She longed for his arms around her, for the weight and warmth of him to anchor her in the terrifying darkness. The depth of her needs shamed her. She had run from one man's possession only to find herself craving another's touch. She was a fool, a weak, foolish woman who had learned nothing. Outside, Eli stood on the porch, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He watched the faint light from her window until it went out. He could still feel the phantom touch of her hand on his cheek, a searing brand of impossible softness. Desire for her was a physical ache in his gut, a fire he had been banking for weeks that now threatened to rage out of control. But he could not. He was a curse. His brother Thomas had loved him, had followed him to war, and had died in a blizzard of gunfire and fear because Eli had frozen. He brought death to those who loved him. To touch Cora, to claim her, would be to sign her death warrant. He was a haunted man, and it was his fate to walk alone. The town was not finished with them. A week later, Sheriff Miller rode out. He was a tall, weary man who looked as if he carried the weight of every sin committed in his jurisdiction. He and Eli spoke on the porch while Cora watched through the window, her stomach in knots. "Some of Mr. Gable's cattle went missing last night. Eli," the sheriff said, not meeting his eyes. "Cut from his north pasture. The one that borders your land." Eli said nothing, his face impassive. "Now, I am not saying it was you," the sheriff continued, shifting his weight. "But you know how folks are. You have history with Gable's family. And with your past," he let the sentence hang. "Suspicion is falling on you. People are stirred up." "Let them be stirred up," Eli said, his voice flat. The sheriff finally looked at him. "It is more than that. Eli, it is the woman." He gestured with his thumb toward the house. "Her being here is riling folks up. It is a complication. It gives them a reason to look at you sideways again." After the sheriff left, a heavy silence descended on the small ranch. Cora felt like a prisoner on the verge of execution. She was the complication. She was the reason the town was turning on him. That evening, as he sat at the table cleaning his rifle, she stood before him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I will leave," she said, the words costing her more than he would ever know. "I will be gone in the morning. I will not be the cause of your ruin." He did not look up, his hands continuing their slow, methodical work on the rifle. The silence stretched, each second a new torment. She thought he had not heard her, or worse, that he was accepting her offer. She was about to turn away, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, when he finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "Stay." He looked up then, and his eyes met hers. The torment she had seen in his room was there again, a raw, unguarded plea. It was not a command. It was not an offer of protection. It was the voice of a man drowning, reaching for a hand in the dark, and in that single, broken word, Cora knew she was lost. His single word, "Stay," was a thread, thin and fragile, but she clung to it as the last days of autumn bled into the gray, brooding chill of winter. The world shrank. The vast, open land that had once seemed a promise of freedom became a cage as the sky turned the color of lead and the wind developed a mournful howl that did not cease for days. The first snow came not as gentle flakes, but as a hard, driving sleet that scratched at the window panes like angry claws. And then the real storm hit. It was a blizzard of biblical proportions, a monstrous, churning sea of white that erased the world. The barn became a half-seen specter. The distant hills vanished entirely. The house groaned under the weight of the snow and the ceaseless assault of the wind. For the first few days, they existed in a state of high alert, their lives pared down to the essential, desperate tasks of survival. Eli, his face grim and set against the cold, would fight his way to the barn to feed the animals, returning encrusted in ice, his breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin. Cora kept the fire roaring, melting snow for water. Her world narrowed to the hearth and the constant, gnawing fear that he might not make it back from one of his treks. Weeks passed. The storm did not break. They were utterly and completely isolated, prisoners in a small wooden box set adrift in an endless ocean of white. Their supplies began to dwindle, the flour sack emptied, then the beans, then the smoked bacon. They were left with a sack of potatoes and the frozen venison Eli had hung in the shed. Their meals became a grim ritual, boiled potatoes and tough, stringy meat, eaten in the flickering firelight as the wind shrieked outside. In the crucible of that forced, silent intimacy, something began to shift. The walls of politeness and caution, already weakened, crumbled into dust. There was no room for pretense when your world was reduced to a single room, a shared fire, and the mutual struggle to simply stay alive. The vast silence that had once separated them was filled now, not with words, but with a new kind of awareness. Cora learned the rhythm of his breathing as he slept on his cot across the room, the low growl of his stomach when hunger gnawed at him. He learned the way she bit her lip when she was worried, the small, unconscious hum she made when she was mending a tear in his shirt by the firelight. Their distance vanished in small, practical ways. One afternoon, the relentless gray light beginning to fade. He took his rifle from its pegs on the wall. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his tone matter of fact. "If something happens to me, if someone comes." He led her out onto the porch, into the blinding white. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace its heavy stock against her shoulder. His body pressed against hers from behind, his arms coming around her to guide her hands. His chest was a wall of solid warmth at her back, his breath a warm cloud by her ear. "Do not be afraid of it," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her spine. "Respect it. Feel its weight. It is a part of you now." Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from his closeness. The scent of pine smoke and winter clung to his clothes, a scent she was beginning to associate with safety, with survival. He helped her aim at a dark knot on a distant fence post, his calloused fingers closing over hers on the trigger. "Squeeze," he said. "Do not jerk it." She did as he said. The rifle exploded against her shoulder, the sound shockingly loud in the muffling silence of the snow. The kick sent her stumbling back against him. He steadied her, his hands firm on her arms. She had missed the post by a foot, but a thrill, fierce and unfamiliar, shot through her. It was a feeling of power, of agency. She was not just a victim, not just a survivor. She was a woman holding a rifle in a wild, unforgiving land, and she was not entirely helpless. He taught her every day after that, and with each lesson, the space between them filled with a quiet, unspoken trust. In return, she taught him. She took the last of the cornmeal and, with a little of the rendered venison fat, showed him how to make cornbread in a cast-iron skillet over the fire. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she moved with a practiced grace, her hands dusty with the yellow meal. He had likely not tasted fresh bread in years. "My mother taught me," she said, the words soft in the quiet room. "She said a home is not a home without the smell of baking bread." When it was done, golden and crusty, she cut a piece for him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, and ate it with a slow, deliberate reverence. A look of something akin to peace settled on his harsh features, a softening of the lines around his eyes. It was a small thing, a piece of cornbread, but in their pared-down world, it felt like a feast, a sacrament. They were no longer just two strangers sharing a roof. They were partners in a fragile enterprise of survival, each offering the other a skill, a piece of themselves. The nights were the hardest. The cold was a relentless, living thing, seeping through the chinks in the walls, stealing the warmth from their bodies as they lay on their separate cots. And with the cold came the darkness, a vast, suffocating blackness that invited the ghosts of the past to come and sit by the fire. One night, Cora woke with a strangled sob, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was back in that parlor, the heavy smell of whiskey in the air, a hand tangled in her hair, a voice whispering promises that had turned to poison. She sat bolt upright, gasping for breath, the terror of the dream so real she could still feel the phantom grip on her arm. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with a deep, menacing chill. A wave of desolation washed over her, so profound it was a physical pain. She was alone, utterly, completely alone. She pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders and stumbled to the stove, her teeth chattering. She had to add wood to the fire, had to fight back the cold and the darkness. As she fumbled with the latch, a low voice came from behind her. "Cora?" Eli was awake. He had risen from his cot and was standing a few feet away, a dark, imposing silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the icy window. He was in his nightshirt, the long cotton garment doing little to hide the powerful lines of his body. The sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such quiet concern, broke something inside her. A sob, raw and ragged, escaped her throat. She could not stop it. The terror of the dream, the loneliness of her life, the strain of the endless winter, it all came pouring out. In 2 long strides, he was there, He did not speak. He simply reached out and pulled her against him, wrapping her in his arms. She buried her face in the hard warmth of his chest, her sobs shaking her entire body. His arms tightened around her, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her loose hair. He held her with a strength that was not constricting, but sheltering. He was a bulwark against the storm, both outside and within. They stood like that for a long time, the only sounds the dying hiss of the embers and her own ragged weeping. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, painting their two figures, clad only in thin night clothes, in hues of gold and black. His skin was warm through the thin cotton, a living, breathing heat that seemed to seep into her very bones, chasing away the chill. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. Slowly, her sobbing subsided, leaving her spent and trembling in his embrace. She did not pull away. She could not. To leave the circle of his arms would be to step back into the freezing darkness, and she did not have the strength. She tilted her head back to look at him. In the faint, glowing light, his face was stripped bare of its usual harshness. His pale eyes were dark with an emotion she could not name, a deep, turbulent sea of it. "I cannot stop thinking about you," she whispered, the words a raw, honest confession torn from the deepest part of her. It was not a plea or a proposition, but a simple, undeniable truth. His breath caught. He lowered his head, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The air between them grew thin, electric. Time seemed to slow, to stretch, to hold its breath. His lips brushed hers, hesitant, a mere whisper of a touch, a question. She answered by leaning into him, her fingers clutching at the fabric of his nightshirt. The kiss that followed was not gentle. It was a collision of loneliness and longing, a desperate, aching need that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. It was the taste of wood smoke in winter, of unspoken grief and shared survival. It was an act of finding shelter not from the storm, but in each other. His arms tightened, lifting her off her feet as his mouth claimed hers more deeply. He carried her the few steps to her cot, the one she had made for herself in this strange, new life, and laid her down on the thin mattress, in the dying firelight. They came together, their movements slow, urgent, almost reverent. It was not a taking, but a giving, a silent, desperate communication in a language older than words. They were two broken, solitary souls, erasing the scars on each other's skin with their hands, their mouths, their bodies, seeking not pleasure, but absolution, and for a few fleeting hours, as the storm raged outside, they were not alone. The next morning, Cora woke to a cold, empty room. The fire was rebuilt and burning brightly, but Eli was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her nakedness. His cot was empty, his boots and heavy coat gone. He had left. He regretted it. The thought was a knife twisting in her gut, the intimacy they had shared, which had felt so profound, so real, had been nothing more than a fleeting response to a cold night and a woman's tears. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons on her dress. When she went outside, the world was blindingly bright. The storm had broken. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the fresh snow was dazzling. She saw his tracks leading toward the line of trees where he set his traps. He had not left her. He had simply gone back to work, back to the routine of their lives, as if nothing had happened. Or perhaps, she thought with a fresh wave of despair, he had fled to the familiarity of his work to escape the memory of the night before. He was gone for 3 days. With each passing hour, Cora's fear grew. The silence of the house was no longer a comfort, but a roaring accusation. She had been a fool. She had offered him her body, her vulnerability, and he had taken it and walked away. The old wounds, the ones left by a man who taught her that a woman's desire was a thing to be used and then discarded, began to ache anew. On the third evening, as dusk was painting the snow in shades of violet and rose, she saw him. He was a dark figure stumbling through the deep drifts, moving with a frightening slowness. He was not riding his horse. As he drew closer, she saw that he was covered in ice, a walking statue of it. She ran out to meet him, her feet sinking in the snow, the cold air burning her lungs. He collapsed into her arms 20 feet from the porch, his body a dead weight. His face was a mask of blue-white frost, his lips cracked and colorless, his eyes barely open. "Horse went through the ice in the creek," he rasped, his voice a dry, rattling whisper. "Walked so long." She half dragged, half carried him into the house, her strength born of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. He was freezing to death. She laid him on the floor by the stove, his body stiff and unresponsive. His clothes were frozen solid. With trembling hands, she took a knife and cut them away, the frozen fabric cracking like bark. His skin beneath was terrifyingly pale and cold to the touch. For the next 2 days, she fought for his life. She piled every blanket they owned on top of him. She heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and packed them around his body. She melted snow and forced warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, between his chattering teeth. She rubbed his hands and feet until her own were raw, trying to bring life back to the frozen flesh. She did not sleep. She just worked, a grim, desperate battle against the cold that had invaded his body. On the second night, the fever came. His body, which had been so cold, was now burning hot. He began to thrash, caught in the grips of a violent delirium. He cried out names she did not know, shouted orders in a voice that was not his own. And then he began to speak of his brother. "Thomas, so cold," he moaned, his eyes wide and staring, seeing a past she could only imagine. "The snow, red, should have moved, should have fired." He clutched at her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes locking on hers, though she knew he was not seeing her. "I froze. Thomas, I froze. Just watched them." A terrible, dry sob shook his frame. "The cold took him before the bullets did. I let him die. I let my brother die." The confession, ripped from the depths of his fevered mind, was the missing piece, the source of the profound, crushing guilt he carried. It was not just grief that haunted him. It was shame. Tears streamed down Cora's face. She leaned down, her heart aching for him, for the boy he had been, for the man he had become. She took his hand, the one that had held the rifle, the one that had held her, and brought it to her lips. She kissed his calloused knuckles, his work-worn fingers. "It was not your fault, Eli," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You hear me? It was not your fault." She repeated the words over and over, a litany, a prayer. "You were a boy. It was war. It was not your fault." He stared at her, and for a moment, a flicker of clarity returned to his eyes. He seemed to see her, to hear her. His face, which had been a mask of torment, began to crumble. A single tear tracked its way through the grime on his cheek. And then he broke. The hard, silent cattleman, the stoic war veteran, broke down and wept, a storm of grief and guilt that had been locked away for years. Finally released. She held him, rocking him like a child, until he fell into a deep, healing sleep. The fever broke before dawn, in the weeks that followed, as the world outside began to thaw. So did something between them. His confession and her forgiveness had forged a new bond, deeper and stronger than the physical intimacy they had shared. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken things, but comfortable, easy. A shared glance across the room could convey more than an hour of conversation. A casual touch as they passed each other was no longer fraught with tension. but a simple, grounding reassurance. He was still quiet, still reserved, but the haunted look in his eyes had begun to recede, replaced by a tentative warmth whenever he looked at her. Spring arrived with a sudden, riotous burst of life. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and the hills turned a vibrant, impossible green. The world felt new, washed clean, full of promise. Cora felt it too, a fragile hope blooming in her chest. One afternoon, needing a few supplies, she took one of the horses and rode into Redemption. The town still watched her with suspicion, but the whispers seemed less venomous now, more curious, as she stood at the counter in the general store, waiting for Mr. Henderson to weigh out some beans. Two men came in. They were rough-looking, strangers, with dust on their clothes and revolvers worn low on their hips. "We are looking for a man," one of them said to the storekeeper, his voice loud and gravelly. "Goes by the name Eli. Might be Morgan, but the name we have on the warrant is Marston. Eli Marston. You know him?" Cora froze, her hand hovering over a bolt of calico. The blood drained from her face, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "Marston." Mr. Henderson shook his head slowly. "The man you are talking about keeps to himself. Do not know his Christian name for certain. He is a hard man, best left alone." "We are not paid to leave men alone," the bounty hunter said with a grim chuckle. "Especially not army deserters." Cora did not wait to hear more. She dropped a few coins on the counter, fled from the store, and untied her horse with frantic, clumsy fingers. She threw herself into the saddle and galloped out of town, kicking the horse into a desperate, headlong race, the name echoing in her mind like a death knell. Marston, Eli Marston. She had found a home in the arms of a ghost, a man who was not who he seemed, and now his past was riding in to claim him. The horse was heaving, its sides slick with sweat and foam. By the time she reached the yard, Cora threw herself from the saddle before the animal had even come to a full stop, her legs unsteady beneath her. She ran toward the house, the words of the bounty hunter a frantic, terrifying drumbeat in her head. Marston, Eli Marston, army deserter. Eli was on the porch, sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only sound in the quiet afternoon. He looked up at her approach, his hands stilling instantly. He saw the wildness in her eyes, the sheer animal panic on her face, and he was on his feet before she reached the first step. "Cora, what is it? What is wrong?" he asked, his voice low and urgent, his body tensed for a fight. "They are in town," she gasped, leaning against a porch post, struggling to draw a breath. "Two men, bounty hunters. They are looking for a man named Eli Marston." She watched his face. For a moment, there was nothing. The mask of the stoic cattleman holding firm. Then, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The light in his pale eyes seemed to dim. The muscles in his jaw locked, and a deep, weary resignation settled over him. The look of a man who had been expecting a ghost for a very long time, and had finally heard its footstep on the stair. He did not deny it. He simply turned and walked into the house. Cora followed, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He went to the fireplace and stood with his back to her, staring into the cold ashes. The silence stretched, thick with a decade of secrets. "My father's name was Marston," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a man reciting a history that no longer belonged to him. "My brother and I, we were born Marstons. We enlisted under that name. We were just boys, full of stupid ideas about glory. We thought it was a grand adventure." He fell silent again, and Cora waited, her own fear a small thing in the face of the vast, ancient grief that filled the room. "You know what happened to Thomas," he continued, his voice rough. "You heard me in the fever. After I watched him die, something in me broke. The uniform was a lie. The glory was a lie. The whole damn war was a lie. It was just blood and snow and boys dying for nothing. The night after they buried him in that frozen ground, I walked away. I took my horse, my rifle, and I just vanished. He turned to face her then, and his eyes were those of a stranger, a man she had never met, haunted by things she could never understand. I rode for weeks, not knowing where I was going. I just knew I could not be Eli Marston anymore. That name was buried with my brother. It was a name of shame. My mother's name was Morgan. It seemed clean, empty, a name a ghost could wear. I came here because no one knew me. I bought this land and I buried myself in it. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, the ghost of Eli Marston would stay dead. The story, told in that dead, flat voice, settled between them. A final, terrible truth. The man she had come to know, the man she had given herself to, was an invention. A fiction built on a foundation of grief and desertion. She was shaken to her very core. The solid ground she thought she had found was once again turning to sand beneath her feet. She could leave, she could walk out the door, and no one would blame her. She could run from this new complication, just as she had run from the last. But as she looked at him, at the raw agony in his eyes, she saw not a deserter, not a liar, but the same broken man she had held in her arms as he wept through a fever. She saw the boy who had frozen in the snow, and the man who had carried that single terrible moment with him every day since. She knew what it was to run, and she knew, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that she was tired of it. "So you will run again?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong, cutting through the heavy silence. "Is that your plan? Vanish into the hills again? Find a new name? A new place to hide?" He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "They will hang me. Cora." "Maybe," she conceded. "Or maybe they will not. But you cannot keep running. Not from them. Not from what happened to Thomas." She took a step closer, her resolve hardening. "And not from me. I will not live with a ghost. Eli, I will not give my heart to a man who is not even here." Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. They both stiffened. A moment later, Sheriff Miller appeared in the yard, the two bounty hunters flanking him. The past had arrived on their doorstep. Eli's hand went to the pistol he wore on his hip, an instinctive, defensive gesture. "No," Cora said, putting her hand on his arm. "Not like this." He looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. For a long moment, he seemed to be weighing his options, a desperate, bloody fight, or a quiet surrender. With a slow, final exhalation, he relaxed, his hand falling away from the gun. He had made his choice. The sheriff and the bounty hunters dismounted, their face grim. "Eli," Sheriff Miller said, his voice heavy with regret. "These men have a warrant. For Eli Marston. For desertion from the United States Army." "That is me," Eli said, his voice calm. The townspeople had followed, drawn by the scent of scandal and violence. They gathered at the edge of the yard. A silent, judgmental jury. Mrs. Gable was there, her face a mask of smug vindication. "We need you to come with us," the sheriff said. But as one of the bounty hunters stepped forward with a pair of irons, a voice cut through the air. "Wait." Jesse, his face still showing the faint yellow of old bruises, pushed his way through the crowd. He walked right up to the sheriff, his young face set with a determination that made him look years older. "You cannot take him," Jesse said. "Son, this is official business," the sheriff warned. "I do not care," Jesse insisted, his voice ringing with conviction. He turned to the crowd. "This man, Eli Morgan, he saved my life. Last year, my horse threw me in the high country, and my leg was broken. I would have died of cold and thirst. But he found me. He set my leg, and he carried me 6 miles back to my family's homestead. He did not ask for thanks or payment. He just did it." He turned back to the sheriff. Is that the act of a man who deserves to be dragged off in chains?" A murmur went through the crowd. Sheriff Miller looked at Jesse, then at Eli, his expression troubled. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West, where an act of courage and decency carried its own weight. "The warrant stands," the sheriff said, his voice firm, but then he added, "But I will not see him taken in irons based on the word of out-of-towners alone. I will hold him in my custody until the circuit judge arrives next month. We will have a proper hearing." He looked directly at Eli. "But there is another option. The warrant is for this territory. If you ride out, if you are gone by sunup tomorrow, I will consider the matter closed." It was an offer of exile, a final chance to run. Later that night, after the sheriff and the bounty hunters and the disappointed crowd had gone, the weight of the ultimatum settled over the small house. The air was thick with it. Eli stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit hills that offered him escape. "I will be gone before first light," he said, his back to her. "No," Cora said, her voice sharp. "You will not." He turned, his face a mask of disbelief and frustration. "Did you not hear him? This is the only way. I ride out, and I'm free. I can start again, somewhere else." "And what about us?" she demanded, stepping toward him. "Will you start us again, somewhere else? Or will you just find another name, another empty house, and wait for the ghost to find you again? How many times do you have to bury yourself, Eli, before you realize you are still alive?" "It is not that simple," he ground out, his hands clenching into fists. "If I stay, I go to prison. For years, maybe forever. You will not wait. You will leave. I will lose you." His voice cracked on the last words, the raw terror of it laid bare. "You think so little of me?" she whispered, her own heart breaking at his lack of faith. "You think my affection is so shallow that a prison wall could stop it?" "You do not know what it is like," he said, his voice rising, lashing out from his fear. "Years of your life, gone, wasted in a cage. You would grow to hate me. You are a fool, woman, if you think you could endure that." The word, fool, struck her like a physical blow. The same word her former betrothed had used, a word meant to diminish her, to make her small. The anger, hot and swift, rose in her. She stepped forward and slapped him, the sound of it a sharp crack in the silent room. His head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming on his cheek. He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. The anger drained out of her as quickly as it had come, replaced by a wave of desperate sorrow. "Do not call me that," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Do not you dare!" She collapsed against him, her fists beating weakly against his chest. "I am not a fool. I am a woman who loves you." The confession hung in the air between them, stunning them both into silence. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, burying his face in her hair. He did not say the words back. He did not have to. She could feel the answer in the desperate strength of his embrace, in the shudder that ran through his body. They stood there, clinging to each other, two solitary souls who had found each other in the wilderness, now facing a world determined to tear them apart. Later that night, unable to sleep, Cora lit a candle and went to his room. She needed to feel close to him, to the man he was, and to the boy he had been. She opened the small wooden chest and took out his brother's journal. She sat on the edge of his bed, the book open on her lap, and began to read. She read about their childhood, about fishing in a creek and stealing apples from a neighbor's orchard. She read about Thomas's admiration for his older brother's strength and quiet certainty. And then she came to the last entry, written just a day before the ambush, the elegant script slightly shaky, as if written in the cold. "The fighting has changed him," Thomas had written. "I fear a part of him died out here on this cursed plain, and I do not know if he will ever get it back. I pray for him. You still have love inside you. Eli, do not waste it." The words were a message from the grave, a plea from the brother whose death had defined Eli's life. Do not waste it. A fierce, unwavering resolve settled in Cora's heart. She knew what she had to do. She found him on the porch, a solitary figure staring out at the dark expanse of the land. She came and stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. I will not be your reason for running, she said, her voice soft but firm. But I will not be the reason you give up, either. He looked at her, his face etched with confusion in the pale moonlight. Marry me, Eli, she said. He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. What? Cora, that is no solution. It will not stop them from taking me. I know, she said, her gaze steady, unwavering. This is not a scheme. This is not a trick to save you. This is for me and for you. If you go to prison, I want to be your wife when I visit you. If they set you free, I want to be your wife when you walk out. And if you run, her voice caught. If you choose to run, I want you to know that you are leaving your wife behind. I want you to know what you are wasting. She was offering him not an escape, but an anchor, a reason to fight, a reason to return. She was offering him a promise, a vow to stand beside him, no matter what came. He looked from her face to the vast, dark wilderness, and back again. He saw the choice before him, the lonely, empty freedom of running, or the terrifying, uncertain hope of staying. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. Yes, he whispered. Yes. They were married the next afternoon. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the valley, they stood under the great, ancient cottonwood tree behind the house, its new spring leaves rustling in the breeze. Jesse was their only witness, his young face solemn and proud as he stood beside Eli. There was no preacher, no crowd, no fancy dress. There was only the vast, silent land, the whispering tree, and the quiet, unbreakable promises they made to one another. I will stand with you, Cora said, her hand in his. In hardship and in peace, I will not leave you. I will come back to you, Eli vowed, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. Whatever happens, I will always come back to you. That night, in the small cabin that was now their home, their love was a different thing. It was not the desperate, frantic collision of the winter storm, but something deeper, quieter, more profound. It was tender. It was aching. It was a fragile, flickering candle of hope cupped in their hands against a gathering wind. They were husband and wife, bound together not by law or church, but by a shared past of pain and a desperate, uncertain prayer for a future. And as they held each other in the darkness, they both knew that the real fight had only just begun. The dawn that followed their wedding was soft and quiet, a fragile peace that felt like a blessing. Cora lay beside Eli, watching the pale light trace the powerful lines of his back. He had not run. He had stayed. The simple, profound relief of it was a warmth that spread through her entire body. He had made his choice. Today, he would ride into town and turn himself in. And she, his wife, would be waiting for him when he came home. It might be months, it might be years, but for the first time in her life, she had a future to wait for. He stirred and turned to face her, his pale eyes soft with sleep. He did not speak, but simply reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. It was a gesture of such simple, quiet possession, of such tenderness, that it made her heart ache. They made love slowly, a silent reaffirmation of the vows they had spoken under the cottonwood tree, a desperate, gentle clinging before the world came to tear them apart. Afterward, he dressed in the near darkness. He moved with a grim purpose, pulling on his boots, checking his pistol, a soldier preparing for his final battle. Cora watched him from the bed, her heart a tight knot of fear and pride. He came and sat on the edge of the cot, taking her hand in his. "I will come back to you," he said, his voice a low, rough promise. It was the same vow he had made yesterday, but now it was freighted with the grim reality of what was to come. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I will be here." He kissed her then, a hard, brief kiss full of unspoken fear and desperate love. "Stay inside until I am well clear of the valley," he said. And then he was gone. She listened to the sound of his footsteps on the porch, the creak of saddle leather, the soft snort of his horse. She waited for the sound of hoofbeats moving down the trail toward redemption, but they did not come. Instead, she heard the faint, rhythmic sound of a horse moving in the opposite direction, toward the high, wild country of the mountains, toward escape. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, washed over her. She threw off the blankets and ran to the door, her bare feet cold against the rough floorboards. She threw it open and stared out into the gray, pre-dawn light. The yard was empty. He was gone. He had not ridden toward town to face justice. He had ridden away, into the wilderness, just as he had done all those years ago. He had run. The world seemed to tilt and slide away from her. The vow, the wedding, the tender intimacy of the night. It had all been a lie. A final, beautiful lie before he abandoned her. He had been terrified of losing her, but in the end, his own fear had been stronger than his love. He had chosen the lonely freedom of running over the promise of her. The devastation was absolute, a hollow, echoing void where her newfound hope had been. She sank to her knees in the doorway, the cold seeping into her bones, and for the first time since coming to this unforgiving land, she wept without restraint, her sobs the only sound in the vast, empty silence of the morning. The town was merciless. When the sun rose and Eli did not appear at the sheriff's office, the bounty hunters rode out to the ranch. They found Cora alone, her eyes red and swollen, her face a mask of numb despair. Their sneering satisfaction was a new kind of cruelty. "Looks like your man flew the coop," one of them drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Cannot say I blame him, but he left you to face the music, did he not?" The news spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. She was the deserter's wife, the fool who had married a coward. When she was forced to ride into town for supplies a few days later, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were open taunts, cruel laughter that followed her down the street. Mrs. Gable saw her outside the mercantile and stopped, her face a perfect portrait of righteous triumph. "The Lord reveals all truths in His own time," the preacher's wife declared, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "A sinful union, built on a foundation of lies, is destined to crumble to dust." Cora said nothing. She held her head high, her face a frozen mask, bought her flour and salt, and endured the gauntlet of their scorn. But inside, she was the one crumbling to dust. He had not just broken his promise to her, he had broken her. She was sitting on the porch that evening, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, when Jesse rode into the yard. He dismounted and came to stand before her, his hat in his hands, his young face creased with worry. "I had to come, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "What they are saying in town, it is not right, it is not true." "Is it not?" Cora's voice was bitter, brittle. "He is gone. Jesse, he ran away." "No, ma'am," the boy said, his eyes earnest. "He did not run away. He ran toward something." Cora stared at him, a flicker of confusion cutting through her grief. "He came to see me the night before he left," Jesse explained. "He asked me to look out for you, to make sure you had enough firewood, to keep an eye on the livestock. He told me where he was going. There was an officer, a Captain Howard, who was there, in the war. This captain, he knew what really happened in that ambush. He knew Thomas was already gone when the order came to retreat. He knew Eli was not a coward, that he was just a boy frozen with grief. Eli thinks if he can find this man, get him to testify, he can clear his name, for good. He did not run from you, Mrs. Morgan. he went to fight for you. The world, which had been gray and dead, suddenly bloomed with a fragile, impossible color. He had not abandoned her. He had gone to fight for a future, for their future. He had lied about surrendering. Yes, but it was a lie born not of fear, but of a desperate, audacious hope. The shame and despair that had been poisoning her drained away, replaced by a fierce, soaring love that was so powerful it took her breath away. He had not run from her. He was trying to come home to her, a free man. From that moment on, everything changed. The work of the ranch, which had been a grim, punishing penance, now became a mission. She was not just surviving. She was keeping their home alive. She was standing guard over the future he was fighting for. The work was brutal. She rose before the sun, her body aching from the unfamiliar labor. She mended fences, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused and scratched. She hauled water, her shoulders burning with the strain. She tended the small herd of cattle, learning their rhythms, their needs. She ran the ranch alone, a solitary woman against a vast and demanding landscape. The work broke her body, but it forged her spirit into something new, something hard and resilient and unbreakable. She changed in other ways. Too, the timid woman who had arrived on a stagecoach was gone. In her place was a woman who looked people directly in the eye, who did not flinch from their judgment. One day, in the mercantile, a man made a crude remark about her being a deserter's widow in waiting. Without a word, Cora turned, picked up a sack of beans, and dropped it on the counter with a loud thud that made everyone jump. She stared at the man with cold, quiet fury until he flushed, mumbled an apology, and shuffled out of the store. They were beginning to learn that Eli Morgan's wife was not a woman to be trifled with. It was not friendship she earned, or even acceptance, but a grudging, hard-won respect. One hot, dry afternoon in late summer, as she was riding back from checking on a watering hole, she saw a plume of black smoke rising from the direction of town. Her heart leaped into her throat. Fire was the great, indiscriminate terror of the West. She spurred her horse, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. By the time she reached Redemption, the saloon was a roaring inferno. Flames licked at the sky, and a thick, choking smoke billowed through the street. A bucket brigade had formed, a frantic, futile effort against the blaze. Men shouted, women screamed, and in the midst of the chaos, a sound of pure terror cut through the noise. "My daughter!" a woman shrieked, her face white with horror. She was one of the saloon girls, her painted face streaked with tears and soot. "Sarah! She was asleep upstairs!" The crowd gasped. The front of the saloon was an impassable wall of fire. No one could get in. But Cora saw that the small alley beside the building was still clear. An external staircase led to the second floor, smoke pouring from the windows. Without a second thought, she dismounted, grabbed a water bucket from a stunned man, soaked the burlap sack she used as a saddle blanket, and ran toward the stairs. "Cora, no!" she heard someone shout, but she did not stop. She wrapped the wet sack around her head and plunged into the blinding, suffocating smoke. The heat was a physical blow, searing her lungs. She stumbled up the stairs, calling the girl's name. "Sarah! Sarah! Where are you?" She found her in a small back room, huddled under a bed, whimpering with terror. The little girl, no more than 6 years old, was paralyzed with fear. Cora scooped her up, wrapping the child in the wet burlap. "It is all right," she murmured, her voice a raw rasp. "I have got you." The main room was now impassable. The floorboards groaned, ready to give way. The only way out was the window. Cora kicked it open, shattering the glass. They were at the back of the building. The ground was a 10-foot drop. Holding the child tight to her chest, she climbed onto the windowsill, turned, and let herself fall, twisting her body to take the brunt of the impact. She landed hard, her ankle twisting beneath her, a searing pain shooting up her leg. A burning timber fell from the roof, landing on the ground beside her. Before she could move, it rolled, its fiery edge pressing against her forearms as she shielded the child. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary scream of pure agony, and scrambled away, pulling the little girl with her. Men came running, and hands lifted the child, lifted her, and carried her away from the roaring heat. She lay on a cot in the back of the mercantile, the town doctor, a grim, harried man, tending to her. Her ankle was badly sprained, and her arms were a mess of angry red burns. But the little girl, Sarah, was safe, clinging to her mother, miraculously unharmed. The townspeople who had once mocked and reviled her now gathered in a silent, shame-faced circle, looking at her with a new and unfamiliar awe. She had done what none of their brave men had dared to do. A week later, as she was healing, her arms wrapped in clean white bandages, Jessie brought her a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was Eli's. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely open it. Cora, it read, I found him. He will testify. The paperwork is being sent ahead. I am coming home. Eli. The words were simple, spare, but they were the most beautiful words she had ever read. He was coming home. He returned 2 weeks later, not alone. He rode into town on his dusty bay, and beside him, on a fine gray mare, was a man in his late 50s with a neat gray mustache and the ramrod-straight posture of a career military man. Captain Howard. They went directly to the sheriff's office. Cora was there, waiting on the boardwalk, her heart pounding. She watched through the window as legal papers were presented, as testimonies were given. She saw the bounty hunters, who had been lingering in town, look first shocked and then disgusted as their prize was stripped from them. The official army documents, combined with Captain Howard's unimpeachable testimony, told the true story. Private Eli Marston had not deserted his post under fire. He had remained with his fallen brother in an act of loyalty, and in the chaos of a mismanaged retreat, had been mistakenly listed as a deserter. It was not treason. It was tragedy. Sheriff Miller came out onto the boardwalk, looking tired but relieved. He addressed the crowd that had gathered. By the authority of the United States Army and the laws of this territory, all charges against Eli Marston are hereby dismissed. He is a free man. A scattered, uncertain cheer went up from a few people, including Jessie and Henderson, but most of the townspeople just watched, their expressions wary. He might not be a criminal, but he was still Eli Morgan, the outsider, the man who lived by his own rules, and she was still his wife. That Sunday, they walked to church together. It was a conscious decision, a test. Cora's arms were still bandaged, a visible reminder of her bravery. Eli walked beside her, his head held high. They entered the small, stark building and sat in a pew at the back. A hush fell over the congregation. All eyes were on them. The preacher, Mr. Gable, delivered a sermon on the sins of pride and deception. His eyes kept flicking toward them. At the end of the service, as the final hymn was sung, Eli and Cora walked to the front. Preacher, Eli said, his voice quiet but clear, echoing in the silent church. We would like you to bless our union as husband and wife. Mr. Gable drew himself up, his face a mask of cold piety. He looked at Eli, and then at Cora, his gaze lingering on her bandaged arms. I cannot, he said. This union was not made before God. It was made in shadow and secrecy. It is not a marriage I can recognize. The final, public rejection, the town's last, cruel judgment. Cora looked at the preacher, at his wife who was staring at them with undisguised contempt, at the faces of the congregation, a mixture of pity, shame, and morbid curiosity, and she felt nothing. Their approval meant nothing to her. She had faced down fire. She would not be burned by the petty hatred of small-minded people. Without a word, she turned, her back straight, her head held high. She walked out of the church and into the bright, clean sunlight. A moment later, The church door opened again. Eli was there. He had followed her. He had made his choice, once and for all. He chose her. He walked to her side, took her hand, and together they walked down the dusty street, away from the church, away from the town, toward home. That night, they sat on the porch of the dark ranch house, the vast, star-dusted sky arching above them. The world was quiet again. It was just the two of them, in the home they had fought so hard to claim. "We will have to build something new," he said, his voice low. "Here, together." "I know," she said. She turned to him, her heart so full of love it felt as if it might burst. The journey had been long and terrible, but it had led her here, to this man, to this moment of quiet peace. She laid her bandaged arm on his, her scarred skin against his. "I cannot stop thinking about you," she whispered, the words no longer a desperate confession, but a simple, profound statement of fact. He turned his head and looked at her, and in his pale eyes, she saw a universe of love and regret and hope. He brought his free hand up and gently cupped her cheek. "I never stopped," he replied. The seasons that followed their reunion were a time of quiet, deliberate healing. The peace they had found was not a gift, but a structure they built with their own hands, day by day. The ranch, once a place of solitary survival, began to thrive under their shared labor. With Jesse's eager help, they became a formidable team. They repaired the sections of fence that had sagged with the winter snows, their hammers ringing out in a steady, companionable rhythm. They broke and sold a string of horses to a neighboring ranch, their combined knowledge of the animals earning them a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. The money they earned did not go toward fancy clothes or trips to town, but was poured back into the land, into the home they were building. Their biggest project was the second bedroom. They felled the timber themselves, and Eli, with a surprising skill Cora had never suspected, began to frame the small addition onto the side of the house. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air, a clean, hopeful smell that overpowered the ghosts of the past. The room was for the child they hoped would come, a testament to their faith in a future that was not yet written. Every nail he drove, every board she held steady, was an act of prayer, a quiet declaration that they intended not just to endure, but to grow. The easy silence between them was no longer a sign of distance, but of a deep and abiding understanding. A shared look, a brief touch of hands as they worked, was all the conversation they needed. They were building more than a room. They were building a life. But in the West, peace was a fragile commodity, a thin layer of topsoil over a bedrock of old grudges and sudden violence. The tragedy, when it returned, came as it always did, without warning. The news arrived with a frantic, dust-covered rider from town. Josiah Gable, the preacher's father and one of the town's founding elders, had been found dead in his study. He had not died of old age. His head had been bashed in with a heavy iron paperweight. The fragile peace shattered. Suspicion, like a foul, choking smoke, immediately drifted toward the Morgan Ranch. The reason was a story almost as old as the town itself, a bitter feud over land and water rights between the Gables and Eli's father that had simmered for decades. Though Eli had never taken part in it, the town had a long memory. He was a Marston by blood, and a Marston had always been at odds with a Gable. His past, which had seemed settled and buried, was exhumed once more. The fact that he was an outsider, a man cleared on a technicality in the eyes of many, made him the perfect, easy target for their fear and rage. The whispers started again, but this time they were not the sly, gossipy whispers of before. They were angry, guttural, and full of a dangerous self-righteousness. By nightfall, the whispers had grown into a roar. Cora was banking the fire when she heard it, a distant, ugly sound carried on the night wind. It was the sound of a mob, a drunken, furious chorus of shouts and curses. She ran to the window and peered out into the darkness. In the distance, She could see a snake of wavering orange lights, a procession of torches winding its way up the trail to their valley. Eli came to stand beside her, his face grim, the brief season of peace wiped clean away, replaced by the old, weary look of a man who had always expected the battle to find him again. "They are coming for me," he said, his voice flat. "They will not have you," Cora said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. Her mind, once a place of fear and indecision, was now clear and sharp as glass. She knew what she had to do. "The root cellar," she said, grabbing his arm. "The door is hidden under the rug. They will not find you there." "Cora, I will not hide like a coward," he protested, his hand going to his pistol. "This is not cowardice. This is survival," she insisted, her grip on his arm tightening, her eyes boring into his. "You will not die tonight because a pack of fools needs someone to blame. You promised you would always come back to me. Now get in the cellar. Jesse is still here. In the barn. I will send him for the federal marshal in Stone Creek. He can ride faster than any of them. You have to give him time. Eli, you have to give us time." He looked at her, at the raw, unyielding strength in her face, and he saw the truth of her words. A shootout would be a suicide. He gave a single, sharp nod, his trust in her absolute. He lifted the heavy plank door, descended into the cool, earthy darkness of the cellar, and pulled it shut behind him. Cora dragged the heavy bearskin rug back over the door, her hands shaking but her purpose firm. Then she sent a terrified but resolute Jesse out the back way, his horse a fleeting shadow against the moonlight as he galloped toward the mountains, toward their only hope. She was alone. She took Eli's rifle from the wall, checked that it was loaded, and went to stand in the doorway of her home, the lamplight from within casting her in a solitary, defiant silhouette. The mob spilled into the yard, a chaotic tumble of 30 or more men, their faces contorted with rage and whiskey, their torches casting wild, dancing shadows that made them look like demons come up from the earth. The preacher, Mr. Gable, was at their head, his face a mask of white-hot grief and righteous fury. "Where is he?" Gable demanded, his voice shaking with a terrible, raw pain. "Where is the murderer?" "There is no murderer here," Cora said, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the angry muttering of the crowd. The rifle in her hands felt solid, an extension of her own will. "Do not lie to us, woman," another man shouted, a rancher whose face she recognized. "We know he did it. It was his family's feud." "My husband is a good man," Cora said, her gaze sweeping over them, meeting their eyes one by one. "He has proven that. Some of you have seen that. He is not a killer." "He is a deserter and a liar," someone yelled from the back. "And you are a mob of drunks and cowards," she retorted, her voice ringing with contempt. "You come here in the dark, with torches and ropes, because you are too afraid to face one man in the light of day." Her defiance stunned them into a momentary silence. They had expected a weeping, terrified woman. They had not expected this. Gable, his grief twisting into a terrible resolve, took a step onto the porch. "We will have justice for my father. Stand aside." Cora did not move. She raised the rifle, not aiming it, but holding it across her chest, a final, unbreachable barrier. "You will not enter this house," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "This is my home. He is my husband." She let the silence hang for a moment, and then she did something they did not expect. With her free hand, she pushed up the sleeves of her dress, revealing the scarred, discolored skin of her forearms. The firelight from their own torches illuminated the marks, the permanent, puckered reminders of the day she had walked through flames for their town, for one of their children. "You see these?" she said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every man in the yard. "I earned these scars saving a life in your town, a town that has shown me nothing but scorn and suspicion. I did not do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And this is what I say to you now. My husband is in that house, and before you lay a single hand on him, You will have to shoot me first. You will have to kill the woman who saved your child. Right here, on this porch." She stared directly at the preacher. "Are you prepared to do that, Mr. Gable? Is that the kind of justice your God demands?" She stood before them, a solitary, scarred woman, armed not just with a rifle, but with their own shame. The men shifted, their drunken bravado beginning to falter. They looked from her arms to each other, their certainty wavering. They were farmers and ranchers, not murderers of women. The preacher stared at her, his face a battleground of grief and a dawning, terrible doubt. The standoff was broken by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A dozen riders, led by a hard-faced man with a silver star on his chest, galloped into the yard, their horses scattering the mob. The federal marshal from Stone Creek had arrived. Jesse, exhausted but triumphant, was right behind him. The bloodshed had been averted. The marshal, a man with no patience for mob justice, took control immediately. He placed Eli, who emerged from the cellar, under his official protection and began an investigation. It did not take long. The real killer was another rancher, a man named Peterson, who was deeply in debt to Josiah Gable. Faced with foreclosure and ruin, he had killed the old man in a fit of rage. The marshal found him at his homestead, a bloody shirt hidden in his rain barrel, and the man confessed everything. The town was forced to look at its own ugliness. The apology, when it came, was not a grand public gesture, but a series of small, quiet acts of atonement. A few of the men from the mob came by, hat in hand, and offered to help Eli with his north pasture fence. Henderson, the storekeeper, gave Cora a bolt of his finest blue calico, refusing any payment. The most telling gesture came from the preacher's wife. One afternoon, she drove her buggy into the yard, walked up to the porch where Cora was sitting, and placed a still warm loaf of bread on the railing. She did not speak a single word. She just looked at Cora, her face filled with a complex mixture of shame, sorrow, and a deep, grudging respect, then turned and walked away. The war was over. In the quiet months that followed, Eli and Cora Morgan began to be seen as something more than a scandal. They were survivors. They were a testament to the fact that love, like the stubborn prairie grass, could grow in the harshest of landscapes. They had faced down the town, the past, and the fire, and they were still standing. They had become, in their own quiet way, a symbol of endurance. One warm evening, as the sun was setting, they walked to the old cottonwood tree where they had been married. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, the same leaves that had witnessed their vows. They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to rose. Cora took Eli's hand and placed it on her belly. "The new room will not be empty for long," she said softly. "I am with child." He looked at her, his pale eyes widening, a slow, dawning wonder spreading across his face. He stared at her for a long moment, as if he could not quite comprehend the magnitude of her words. Then, the strong, silent man who had survived a war and a lynch mob, who had never flinched from a fight, did something she had never seen him do. His face crumpled, and he fell to his knees in the soft grass. He pressed his face against her, his arms wrapping around her waist, and he kissed her belly, his tears of profound, unutterable joy soaking through the thin fabric of her dress. He was not just a survivor anymore. He was a husband, a father-to-be, a man with a future. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, they stood together on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked out at the wild, sweeping landscape stretching before them, a land of brutal winters and glorious springs, of sudden, violent storms and quiet, breathtaking beauty. It was harsh. It was beautiful. It was the place they had fought to keep. It was home. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.